Book TV recently went up to Capitol Hill to ask members of Congress about their reading lists.
Congressman Jerry Connolly from Virginia's 11th Congressional District. What are you reading?
Well, I've read a lot of really wonderful books. The one I'm reading right now is Max Hastings' new book on the history of the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1975. It is terrific. I'm not yet finished with it, but I'm getting close. And it's just gripping. And a lot of it is also told from the Vietnamese point of view, both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, and what it was like on the other side during this horrific war. Very critical of both communist tactics as well as American and French tactics during the French period and the American period of the Vietnam War. But it is terrific history. If people want to understand what happened in Vietnam and that legacy, this is the one volume to read. It is just a great book and brilliantly written. Necessary history if you're a history buff at all. This is a book called The Field of Blood by Joanne Freeman, and it's actually a history of violence in the Congress, here in the United States Congress. And she does a great job of pointing out that, the famous incident of Preston Brooks beating Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate with a cane as a prelude to the Civil War is sort of the often cited incident of violence. But as she points out, there's a long history of violence. And she tells the story through the memoirs and notes of a clerk of the House who actually memorialized a lot of what happened. And it was fistfights, it was duels, it was threatened duels, it was group fisticuffs and violence or near violence. But it was a lot more commonplace in the Congress than we like to want to believe about ourselves. Not a good tradition, and she does a great job of telling that history. This book by Linda Gordon is the second coming of the KKK. The first coming of the KKK was right after the Civil War, when Nathan Bedford Forrest formed armed resistance to Reconstruction and the rights of newly freed African Americans. The second coming of the KKK really takes place around World War I and grows in the 1920s. And the KKK became a force to be reckoned with politically. It controlled many state governments, including the state of Indiana, the state of Oregon. Their reach was very alarmingly great. And they sort of organized themselves like a sort of social club. They finally came to ruin by the end of the 20s because of corruption, but not because of the odiousness of their political message. And this is definitely a modern history of the KKK in the 20th century that is definitely worth reading. And it has some alarming lessons for today, because some of the rhetoric and some of the activities of the renewed white supremacist movement in the United States eerily resembles what happened in the 1920s in our country, and that's a place we don't want to go back to. A great book. Oh, I really enjoyed this book. This is the story, Scarface and the Untouchable. Scarface was the nickname for Al Capone because he had been injured in a big brawl, a violent incident, I believe when he was in New York, and had a big scar on his face he was always conscious about and tried to cover up. And he was called Scarface. But this is the story of Al Capone and Elliot Ness and their titanic struggle to try to control organized crime in Chicago. And it's a great social history. Capone was a very complex figure. He was not, a unidimensional cartoon character. He had enormous influence in Chicago in the 1920s until he went to jail on a tax charge. And this is the story of how the federal government tried to organize itself to deal with organized crime. And although they finally got Capone, in many ways it didn't solve the problem, because Frank Nitto simply succeeded Capone and ran the outfit for decades, thereafter. So it didn't dismantle organized crime, but it finally did get sort of, the #1 target, both for the FBI and for the federal government. But this is a great story and great social history of prohibition and how lawless really local government was at the time in Chicago. Great story. This book was written in the 1930s. It's called The Black Jacobins, and it's the story of Toussaint Louverture in Haiti and the revolution in the 18th and early 19th century in Haiti that won Haiti its independence as the first independent black country in our hemisphere. And really a great story. And it was a very violent time, and involves the French Revolution and Napoleon, and obviously what happened in Haiti actually is what motivated Napoleon to cut a deal with Thomas Jefferson and sell the Louisiana territory to the Americans, because he was being bled dry with the revolution going on in Haiti. But what's interesting is this book is written in the 1930s. And so it's written while segregation is very much alive and well here in the United States, and while colonialism is thriving in Africa. And so many of his footnotes are reflecting on the reality of the world racially in the 30s, while reflecting on what Haiti really meant. And it's a fascinating look back at that historical period. And what a heroic character, and ultimately tragic character, Toussaint Louverture really was for the liberation of the Haitian people and black people everywhere. The Bible on Earth was a fascinating book by Finkelstein and Silberman, and it's two archaeologists in Israel who are looking at modern archaeological finds and comparing it to accounts in the Bible. Maybe not surprisingly, they find the Bible takes a lot of liberty with the facts on the ground. And that a lot of things didn't happen the way they were described, or didn't happen at all. That doesn't mean they're not valid stories, but the history, the idea that the Bible is historically inerrant is simply not true, not borne up by archaeological finds. And it's just a fascinating account. If you like archaeology, I really enjoyed this book. 10 Caesars by Barry Strauss is sort of the going from the first emperor, Augustus, to one of the most famous, Constantine. And these were transformative figures in the history of ancient Rome. And the power they accreted, the influence they exerted, and how important they were for their time in spreading and trying to protect Roman dominance in the Mediterranean world. Fascinating stories, some of them very flawed characters, of course. And you can sort of see that the cult of emperors was in many ways planting the seeds, ultimately, of Rome's own destruction. But really wonderful history and great stories. If you like ancient Roman history, and I do, this was really a great find. Ralph Peters has written a series of novels on the Civil War, and it's hard to find a novel on the Civil War that surpasses Michael Schur's famous Killer Angels about the Battle of Gettysburg. And so I generally shy away from novels about the Civil War. I like to read the history of it. But Ralph Peters has done a great job of getting the history right and really kind of describing what it was like for the ordinary soldier, the terror of the battlefield, the horrors of the battlefield, the courage it took, the fear they obviously faced, and the conditions they had to live with, as well as the broader history of what happened tactically and strategically. And the first one of the 6 he's written is Kane at Gettysburg, and it was actually really good. And I'm looking forward to reading his other books as well. Frank and Al, for somebody who loves politics, and I do, Frank and Al is a great book. It's written by Terry Galway, and it's about the friendship and then the rivalry between two great characters of the 20th century, Al Smith and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And as often happens with close political friendships, the one eclipsed the other, and the one who was eclipsed didn't like it too much, and never quite got over it. And so, even though Franklin Roosevelt really was a steadfast supporter of Al Smith, he nominated him twice to be president of the United States at the Democratic Convention. He campaigned for him all across the country and certainly in New York State. He succeeded him and was his hand-picked successor to be governor of New York, to succeed Al Smith. But once he became governor of New York, Smith kind of thought he'd be a puppet. Smith would take it from here, and he'd write, or his staff would write his speeches, and he had a little legislation, and Roosevelt was not that kind of guy. And affable though he was going to be his own man. And that was the beginning of the fracture of the relationship. And ironically, it led to Al Smith kind of abandoning his own progressive values and endorsing both Alf Landon and Wendell Willkie when they ran against Franklin Delano Roosevelt for re-election in the 32 campaign and the 36 campaign. And that was kind of a dark mark on Al Smith. Nonetheless, Franklin Delano Roosevelt kept up the friendship, would drop him notes, and forgave him. But it's a very interesting both friendship and alliance, and also incredible social history about working conditions for working men and women. Al Smith, in the prime of his career, was a great progressive and clearly was a preamble to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal and that progressive tradition. Great, great political history and well done. And finally, a book I want to highlight is FDR and the Jews by Brightman and Alan Lichtman, Alan Lichtman being a professor here at American University. There are a lot of people who kind of get the history wrong about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during the Nazi period in the 30s and during World War II, about what he could do and what he didn't do. This book kind of is a more sympathetic portrait of what Franklin Delano Roosevelt was dealing with and what he tried to do. There were a lot of pressures in the United States at the time, not all of them very pretty in terms of anti-Semitic pressures. And he had to face those headwinds, and he was constantly pressing the system to try to allow more refugees into the United States when nativism and the huge nativist movement in the United States to keep us out of the entanglements in Europe, led by demagogues like Father Coughlin and Charles Lindbergh. And those were real forces while FDR was in the White House. He had to contend with, many of which were tinged with virulent anti-Semitism. And he tried to resist that and push the envelope a lot to try to allow, especially Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe, into the United States, especially children. Didn't always succeed, didn't always do it as forcefully as maybe we would have liked in retrospect. But this book is a sympathetic portrait of his efforts and the difficulties he faced at the time. And well done, about a topic that's always going to be a very sensitive one in terms of our history. And that's sort of my account of what I've been reading lately.
Congressman Jerry Connolly, thank you for your time.
My great pleasure.
We want to hear what you're reading. Send us your list on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at BookTV.